بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم ما بعد فقد قال الله تعالى في كتابه العزيز بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل بفضل الله وبرحمته فبذلك فليفرحوا هو خير مما يجمعون وقال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم خيركم من تعلم القرآن وعلمه أو كما قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. Dear friends, brothers and sisters, inshallah we'll be covering a very beautiful surah. One of my favorite surahs has become my favorite surah for many reasons. Hopefully by the end of this session, it will also become somewhat enjoyable to all of you, inshallah ta'ala. Imam Ghazali rahimahullah, whenever he would begin a session of tafsir, whenever he would start a session of contemplating upon the Quran, since he comes from a place of reason and he shares for many of his opinions, the reason behind that opinion. He doesn't limit himself to the text of Quran and Hadith, and therefore many people resonate with him in our time because he will constantly convince us that there's also reason found in every type of commandment of deen. And that's a reality. We all believe that, we all understand that, but to know what the reason is and to understand it, it requires some level of explanation. And when he would start tafsir, one of the first things he would explain is that the Quran is not simply there for spiritual growth. Quran is also there for intellectual growth. Quran also allows us to grow intellectually. Quran also allows our mind to grow the same way, or rather at a much superior way, in a much more superior way, just like how a person knows and understands. When I sit in a class of physics or whatever it may be that we're learning, it allows us to grow, it allows our mind to blossom, it gives us more knowledge, it gives us the know-how of whatever that subject is. The reality is that the Quran does the same, not for a specific niche subject of life that we rarely ever come across, but rather the Quran does that for life itself. It gives us the ability to understand how to live life. It allows our mind to connect with the realities of life, and of course, it allows the heart to be given light. But that light is not without reason. That light is not just for the heart to grow. That light is not only for the heart to feel comfortable. That light is also for us to grow within our minds and to know how to go about life. The Prophet ﷺ never sat in a classroom. He never sat in a college campus. He never sat with a professor. He never sat with the monks and priests of the previous generations and the previous religions. And that was one of the attempts that the people of Makkah and the mushrikun of Makkah would claim, that you probably learn all of this from the priests and the monks. And whenever they would say that, Allah would defy that by explaining how their opinion was wrong. Like in Ashabul Kahf, like in Surah Yusuf. And then they would understand that this is not from those people. So where was the Prophet ﷺ able to learn not how to pray, not how to give charity, not how to fast, but how to live life, how to deal with people? Even the non-believers would be envious of his kindness. They would never be able to deny his truthfulness, his honesty, as-sadiq al-amin. Every aspect of his life was such that we could look at it not subjectively and objectively say there's no person who could have done this better. Where did he learn it from? This is not a worship that we're referring to. We're referring to living life, knowing how to do the things in life that we do, that at times we say, why am I not looking at the Quran? Because the Quran will tell me how to be a Muslim. The Quran will explain to me what I need to do in the masjid. The Quran will give me the know-how of worship. That's not true. We don't limit the Quran to those things, though it obviously does that as well. The Quran came to allow us to understand how to live life in the best way, to give us the details of how our mind should think, to teach us the mentality and the mindset of life. The most bought books and purchased books are books that talk about mentality. How to have a mindset of a millionaire. I mean, that's great, but it'd be nice to know how how do you become it, right? They don't talk about that because there's no way, it's from Allah. But the mindset, because everyone knows that everything starts from a mentality, it starts from a mindset. So when he would start sessions of tafsir, it's very important for us. He would preface it by saying that we're not learning this to simply know how to do the things that we need to know how to do within our worship, but this is actually teaching us how to live life. This allows us to become better humans, not just better Muslims. And obviously being a good Muslim means we're good human beings. One does not defy the other. So therefore, as we begin this beautiful surah, we interact with it, understanding that it's also helping us grow, not just helping us become more spiritual. That is definitely a goal. The Orientalists and others will study the Quran to simply grow their mind. And the difference is that we study the Quran to grow our hearts and grow our mind. We want our heart to be united with the light of Allah, and we also want to be able to grow in the way that we make decisions in life within the paradigm of the Quran. Right? Decisions come from here. The thoughts come from the heart. But the mind, Ghazali argues that what is the difference between a mind and a heart when it comes to decision making? He says that initially, the thought of that deed or the thought of that action comes in the heart. That is a ham. And the heart flutters with the idea. It thinks of it. It contemplates it. And if the heart accepts it, and that's why Shaitan's goal is not to affect us intellectually. The Shaitan's goal is الَّذِي يُوَسْوِسُ فِي صُدُورِ النَّاسِ. He wants to get into our heart. Because if the heart accepts it, it will start trying to convince the mind. And therefore, it is very difficult to convince someone whose heart has become attached to something through reason to become detached from it. If you understand, you understand. Even though there's reason why you shouldn't marry this person, or why you shouldn't purchase this car, or why you shouldn't take this job. But when the heart becomes attached to it, it's very difficult to undo it. And we respond by saying, yes, I know it doesn't make sense, but what can I do? My heart is connected. It's attached to it. So Shaitan works on the heart. So the primary beneficiary of the Quran is the heart. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to نَزَلَ بِهِ الرُّوحُ الْأَمِينَ عَلَى قَلْبِكَ لِتَكُونَ مِنَ الْمُنذِرِينَ. That it comes to your heart. But then it also grows the mind. There is no book that you can read that will allow us to grow spiritually and intellectually with reason and rationality more so than the Quran. Why is that the case? Because learning normally happens through two ways. The first way that a person learns is the most basic way. The most basic way that a person is able to retrieve knowledge or information is what? Your five senses. Mahsusat, the husus, the things that you can see, touch, feel. This gives you knowledge. This gives you information. Children who are not mature, who have not grown intellectually, that is the only way they can learn. Because that's all they have. So you can tell a child that the cup is hot, but he'll never understand until he touches the cup. You can tell a child that this is dangerous for you, but he'll never understand until he actually falls down. And then he won't do it again, or she won't do it again. Because that's all they have. But if an adult who is mature limits their movements to their senses, we call that person immature. That person who lacks what? The second stage of learning, that person lacks common sense and intellect. The person says, and nowadays we say the same. And it's a sign of not spiritual immaturity, it's a sign of general immaturity of intellect that we say, oh, well, you told me about it, but I had to experience it for myself. But you have intellect. Couldn't you see that there was something harmful there? Why would you step on it for? Couldn't you see the smoke that was coming out? Right? Couldn't you just gauge it? Intellect and reason is there. As you grow up, a person becomes mature, their intellect becomes a superior way of retaining knowledge and information. They don't limit themselves to senses. Those senses always will be there. They will always be a source of knowledge. But intellect supplements that. These are the only two ways that humanity has, except until the third process was given to us. And the third was revelation. Just like how a person would be seen to be immature or lacking just genuine intelligence, if as an adult they limit themselves to their senses, and a person would say, what we say, use your brain. Where's your intellect? That's what Allah says, أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ أَفَلَا تَدَبَّرُونَ أَفَلَا تُبْصِرُونَ. At least use your intellect. We would say this person is lacking intelligence. Similarly, in the presence of divine revelation, if a person limits himself to their senses and reasons, that's also a sign of immaturity. Because now we have a supplementary source that is superior. That is wahi in revelation, which we will be covering in this surah, which is the Quran. Now it gives the third layer. Does reason defy senses? No, it doesn't. It supports it. Does revelation defy reason? It absolutely does not. It supports it. But sometimes reason is present, but our senses cannot experience it. Similarly, sometimes revelation is present, but our intellect and reason cannot truly comprehend it. And that's why we have revelation. And I say all of this because this surah is the highlight of this surah. The focus of this surah is about revelation and where it comes from and the impact that it has on humanity, believers and disbelievers. The impact that it has on anyone that listens to it, even if they don't wish to accept it. The impact that it has upon non-Muslims and Muslims. And this is where Surah Al-Najm begins. So that was a preface that is absolutely necessary for us to understand why we're learning what we're learning. We're not learning what we're learning simply for the purpose of, becoming better and praying our salat. That needs to happen. But we're also learning to be convinced that this is what allows me to grow in every aspect in my life, because it's the most superior, it's the most complete way of learning, which is the Quran. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins this surah highlighting that, where he speaks about وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى. Before we start this, the focus of tafsir, whenever I try to cover tafsir of any surah, is that we know these surahs are placed in the way they're placed, not based upon the timing of revelation, but based upon the placement that was given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. It was not just a shuffle, press shuffle and what? Everything goes where it's supposed to go. It was designed to be where it is. And once we understand that, there is benefit and wisdom in trying to extract why they are sequenced in such a manner. So what is this surah before Surah Najm? Surah Tur. And of course, this is just like my personal, I guess, bias to these surahs, where I feel like these surahs that come in the 27th juz, the flow of them is one of the most beautiful flows, right? Surah Rahman is like the peak of it, but you have Surah Tur, then you have Surah Najm, then you have Surah Qamar. If you're Hafidh, you don't like Surah Qamar, I know, right? It's a hard surah to recite in Taraweeh. Then you have Surah Rahman, then you have Surah Waqi'ah, then you have Surah Hadid. Absolutely beautiful surahs, just based on their sequence. But we're not going to speak about all of them, but focusing on Surah Najm. Right before Surah Najm is Surah Tur. Right before Surah Tur is Surah Dhariyat. And before Surah Dhariyat is Surah Qaf. I'll stop there. There's more. We can literally go back one by one to the entire Juz 26 and do the same thing. But starting from Surah Qaf. Surah Qaf began with what? Qaf wal Quran al-Majid. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala swears by the Quran and its sacredness and its honor and its the power that it gives the ummah. Wal Quran al-Majid. It's a form, Majid refers to Majd, which is honor. It gives you a sense of might. It gives you a sense of presence. This is what the Quran is supposed to do for us. It's supposed to give us presence in our life. And it can only give us a presence if it has a presence within our heart. So Al-Quran al-Majid, Allah starts off just honoring the Quran. He doesn't speak much about it in Surah Qaf. He's building it up. In Surah Dhariyat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, I know you guys are questioning this book, but let me tell you, إِنَّهُ لَحَقٌّ مِثْلَ مَا أَنَّكُمْ تَنْتِقُونَ. Now I'm going to lead up to Surah Najm. إِنَّهُ لَحَقٌّ مثل ما أنكم تنطقون. Allah says that verily this is the truth. Just like how your speaking can be heard by you, and what your speech is saying, what you are saying is the truth, that you consider it to be real words, the Quran is real. That's one understanding of that ayah. The second understanding of that ayah is it is true even by your words, which is the tafsir I prefer. إِنَّهُ لَحَقٌّ مِثْلَ مَا أَنَّكُمْ تَنْطِقُونَ. You know this is the truth even by your words. You just don't want to accept it. يَعْرِفُونَهُ كَمَا يَعْرِفُونَ أَبْنَاءَهُم. You know it's true, but you don't want to accept it. Then the next surah is surah what? Surah Tur. Where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I know what you're saying, and now I'll go over all of those claims. There are about 9 claims in Surah Tur that Allah shares with us that the non-believers, the atheists, the agnostics will make. And one of them is, فَذَكِّرْ فَمَا أَنْتَ بِنِعْمَةِ رَبِّكَ بِكَاهِنٍ وَلَا مَجْنُونٍ أَمْ يَقُولُونَ شَاعِرٌ. Right? Where Allah says, I know that you are saying that these are the words of a sorcerer, a magician, or a poet. So Allah shares with us their claim. And then in Surah Al-Najm, Allah clarifies the response. وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى مَا ضَلَّ صَاحِبُكُمْ وَمَا غَوَى وَمَا يَنْتِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَى. He is not a sorcerer getting this from a star. He's not a magician getting this from some magic or sorcery of his. Rather, he's getting it directly from who? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then in Surah Al-Qamar, Allah says, even though I've clarified it for you, you still think it's magic. And then in Surah Al-Rahman, Allah says, guess what? Ar-Rahman allama al-Quran. That Allah is the most merciful, and the greatest sign of His mercy is that He has allowed you to accept the Quran. If you haven't accepted it, it's on you. Now I've already given you the proofs. Now I've already laid it out for you. That in Surah Qaf, I told you how powerful it is. In Surah Dariyat, I told you that you believe it through your own words. And Surah Tur, I share with you the responses that you have and the questions that you have against the Quran. In Surah Najm, I clarify them. And I clarify in the most profound manner, speaking about the Mi'raj of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And in Surah Qamar, though you've been convinced that this is the truth, you respond by saying it's a lie again. Because you have a script in your head. And a lot of those naysayers already have pre-planned scripts in their head. That every time you give them a response about what deen is and the reality of deen, they'll just come back with the same response. It's like playing a tape recorder that's broken. It keeps saying the same thing, but it can't be true. But it can't be true. And it's magic, it's sorcery, it's a poet. Then at the end of this, Allah says, well, the people who have earned my mercy are allam al-Quran. Those that have accepted the Quran. Surah Rahman is a surah filled of undeniable blessings. That's why it's called Ala'i Rabbikuma Tukadhiban. Ala are blessings that nobody can deny. Ni'mas are blessings that can be subjective. A ni'mah can be a ni'mah for you, but not for him. Some person, for one, they may consider wealth to be a ni'mah. But for others, they may not consider it to be a ni'mah. That's why Allah doesn't speak about wealth in Surah Rahman. Allah doesn't speak about children in Surah Rahman. Allah speaks about ala. They're undeniable blessings. Everyone will accept them to be blessings because everyone needs them, such as the sky, the earth, and water. But Allah begins the discussion of those blessings by saying, Allam al-Quran. Just like how the presence of the trees and the stars and the moon are undeniable in their blessings and the way that the world is structured, they depend upon the movements of these things. It's an undeniable blessing that you have the Quran. Allam al-Quran. That is one sequence of these surahs. Another sequence that is taking place within these surahs is in Surah Tur, Allah starts off by speaking about a mountain. In Surah Najm, Allah begins speaking about what? A star. How about the next surah? Allah speaks about the moon, just the beginning of them. So I started off with the general sequence about the Quran alone. That's the first relationship. And if you can remember this, that would be pretty cool, right? You can go back and say you're a mufassir. Like, you know, fake it till you make it, as we all are. So the first correlation is just about the Quran. The second correlation is how these surahs begin. Surah Tur begins with what? Mountain. Surah Najm begins with what? Star. Surah Qamar begins with what? Qamar. Surah Rahman begins with what? Quran, of course. And then it speaks about all of these together. Right, does it not? الشمس والقمر بحسبان والنجم والشجر يسجدان والسماء رفعها ووضع الميزان. Allah speaks about all of them. So it's like a build-up. And this is how a great essay or a great lecture is. That in your thesis, you share your main points. And each paragraph refers back to the thesis. Right? There's no one that can write a script better than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And just like how a good story takes you a minute to what? Connect the dots. And it takes a level of tadabbur, just pure reflection. It takes some time to connect the dots. But when you do, it leaves you astonished. Ajibu, right? You're left speechless. Abdullah ibn Abbas would say that I have not recited an ayah with reflection, except that every single time I recite that ayah, even if it's the same ayah, I'm still less speechless because I find something new from it. Because reflection and tadabbur. A person can only do that if they don't act like they already know it, right? Which is the basic the prerequisite of learning in any subject, but specifically deen, is coming to it as if you've never heard it. This is why Musa alayhi salam was told, فَاسْتَمِعْ. Just listen. In Surah Taha, Allah tells the Prophet, this is hadithu Musa. This is a new story of Musa, but it was not new. The idea is receive it as if it's what? Your first time. And a lot of times you hear people in Jummah or people in different halaqat, why aren't you listening? I already heard this before. I already listened to this before. The Quran has a story of Musa repeated about 17 times, right? If repetition was something that was to be frowned upon, the Quran would not have done it. So why does the Quran do it? One of the main purposes is to give us different lessons from it. It's the same story, but different lessons. If you listen to it as if it's your first time listening to it every single time we'll take a new lesson from it. That's what Abdullah ibn Abbas would do. His student Mujahid says, sometimes he would recite an ayah and he would be teaching us and he would just read the ayah, like وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى. And he would stay quiet for a long period of time. Then he would read it again and stay quiet for a long period of time and read it again. And sometimes an entire lesson of an hour would go just by doing that. Imagine if I did that, right? First of all, we never have students again. Well, second of all, I'm not that deep. I would fall asleep. I'm too tired for that, right? And the students would just sit there, right? And they would ask, what happened? I'll tell you tomorrow in the next session. And he would say, yesterday I read the verse and Allah opened these things to me. And he would share them, right? So there's so much to take from these verses, and hence we connect with it as if it's our first time listening to it. So that's the second sequence. Cool? The third sequence, and I'm hoping it's not too much, right? But the third sequence, I don't get a chance to teach Tafsir to Miftaah students in the associate program because I'm blessed and honored to teach Arabic, right? The entire year, and it's a class that nobody wants to come to except for me. I truly enjoy teaching Arabic, right? And these, some immersion Miftaah, even Miftaah online, by the way, I don't teach anything but Arabic because no one else wants to teach it. I don't know why. I know why, but khair, alhamdulillah, I enjoy it. I'm not complaining. So I'm going to give you as much as I can, and I'm going to try my best to not overwhelm anyone. But if you write notes, you'll remember it. If you don't write notes, then hopefully you have the memory of Imam Bukhari. You can remember all of it through another way. So the last sequence is the ending of these surahs. And I won't go through all of them. I'll just go through the ending of Surah Tur and the beginning of Surah Najm. How does Surah Tur end? وَمِنَ اللَّيْلِ وَإِدْبَارًا نُجُومٌ. Allah says, praise Allah. فَسَبِّحْهُ. Praise Allah when the stars are what? When the stars come out. Right? When the stars, meaning in the evening time, you should what? Praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then Allah begins the next surah saying, وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى. Speaking about the same star again. And he does this quite often, where he ends a surah and he begins the surah with the same flow. And it's a continuation because the Quran is one book. The chapters are broken up. Just put the charger. It's not connected. So the Quran is connected throughout the entire Quran. So over here, Allah is referring to that the stars at nighttime, you should praise Allah, but you praise Allah, not the what? Not the what? The star. Don't praise the star. وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى. The stars are nothing. You're just using it as a point of reference. Sometimes we acknowledge or we praise a system so much, it almost seems as if we find our system to be inferior. Right? Like, look at the way they do it. Look at what they have. Allah said, no. We identify the stars are my creation. And they're beautiful. And when you see them, you praise Allah because it was me that gave them to you. But وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى, you don't use them as a form of worship. You don't use them as a form of worship. Because even the stars, أَفَلَا لَا أُحِبُّ الْآفِلِينَ, even the stars, they lose their light when the morning time comes. And Allah is not of that nature. So Allah is connecting, praising Allah through these blessings, but not identifying them to be the goal or to be God. Similarly, anytime we're blessed, we're taught to say, فَسَبِّحْ, we praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these are the three general sequences that I wish to share with all of us. And now that being said, we'll move forward, inshallah ta'ala. Surah Al-Najm is a Makki surah, right? And it was revealed, there's differences of opinions, but the most accurate opinion that we find in our books of Tafsir is that it was revealed in the 5th year of Nabuwah, 5th year. And it's very interesting, the first 2 to 3 years of the Prophet's prophethood was the Prophet giving da'wah to his own family members, one-on-one da'wah, giving da'wah to people, one-on-one. There was no open da'wah that was given. But in year 3, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded the Prophet to go ahead and قُمْ فَأَنذِرْ, go ahead and give da'wah to everyone. So when the open da'wah began, open persecution began. Till that point, it was hidden persecution. Now open persecution began. And then now in year 5, what happened? What happened in year 5? That open da'wah's impact was felt by the conversion of Umar radiyallahu anhu and Hamza radiyallahu anhu. And what happened to Islam when Umar became Muslim? What happened to Islam when he became Muslim? The Prophet says that may Allah honor you the same way you honored this religion. The same way you coming into this deen has honored us. So Umar became Muslim, which then not only allowed the Muslims to preach openly, because that was already happening, but to preach in the most heart and center of the community, which was what? The Kaaba. Till then, there was open da'wah happening, but not da'wah that was taking place from the Kaaba itself. There was open da'wah in markets, open da'wah in other places where the public was not as present. But when he became Muslim, this is why we say, when Umar became Muslim, there was open da'wah. Open da'wah had already begun, but open da'wah to the extent that it was happening from city center, right? Like one is to have a rally in some corner alleyway, and the other is to have a rally in Hart Plaza. There's a difference. The coverage is different. The coverage is different. The impact is heard. The impact is much larger and heavier. So Prophet ﷺ, after his Islam, Umar anhu, and Hamza and others, open da'wah was now being taking place in the center of the community, which is the Kaaba. And this is why Abdullah ibn Mas'ud says that the first time the Quran was recited in the open from the Kaaba, from the member, for example, from the member, was Surah Al-Najm. Till this moment, the people of Makkah have heard the Quran. They've heard Surah Haqqa. They've heard these surah. They've heard Iqra. They've heard Surah Mudaththir and Muzammil. They've heard it, but not together at one time. They were just walking by and hearing it. And the Quraysh, and the people of Makkah quite generally, whenever they would hear the Quran being recited, they would actually do these interesting things. Like Allah speaks about Nuh alayhi salam's nation doing the same. They would go ahead and start closing their ears, or they would start actually yelling. Like what? You know when someone's saying something that you don't want to hear, what do you do? Like if you're immature. I don't want to hear, I don't want to hear. This is what Meccan used to do. I don't want to hear, I don't want to sound. Because they don't want to get, because they know if they hear what's going to happen. It's going to affect them. They would also go ahead, and the moment the Prophet would start reading, like in smaller areas, they would start walking by and reciting their poetry to entice people. If the Prophet was giving da'wah in a market, they would gather young brothers and sisters, and they would start having a concert across. So now of course, it diverts the audience because people's hearts are inclined towards new things. Just because a new ideology or a new system or even a new ism has picking up steam doesn't mean it's right. It's the nature of a human being that when new things come out, they will first try to see what it is. They will try to experience it. This is why they always try new flavors in different stores. Why? Because they know people will still try it. It's natural for a human being. They say in Arabic, kullu jadidin ladid. Every new thing is what? Tasty. It's not actually tasty. It's just what? It's new. So now the Prophet giving da'wah, they would come start singing next door. And they would start doing their own thing. And this is the reality whenever we make an effort of deen. That whenever we start making an effort of deen, whenever you, any of us, families, individuals, start doing something good, there will always be a deterrent. There will always be interruption that is taking place by batil as well. Something good starts, something bad will start too. Something good begins, something bad will start. Shaitan will always try to repel that good with something else. Now we may be able to see it, we may not be able to see it, but that's a trick of shaitan, which inshallah you'll be learning in Shaykh Abdullah's class anyways. So this is what was happening whenever the Prophet would read. Now, when everyone is gathered in front of the Kaaba, city center, the entire group, everyone is there. The Prophet stands up and he starts reciting. Now, while everyone is standing there, he begins reciting. Nobody feels, of course, the Prophet demands respect. You can't disrespect him because of his presence as well. So as he begins reciting, none of the leaders of Quraysh felt comfortable to speak up because there was the entire community there. You know when there's only leaders sitting, leaders will what? Say things to each other even in disrespectful ways. But now, I'll give you an example. If parents are sitting together and arguing, they'll say a lot of things. The parents that have some intellect, if kids come across, what do? They stop saying it. Not because they don't want to say it, it's because now who's there? And they're not afraid of disrespecting their spouse. They're afraid of losing their respect in front of their children. So they don't want to say anything. Similarly, till this point, it's never been one place. Now, since everyone is there, the leaders of Makkah don't want to start screaming and saying things because the normal civilians of Makkah will look at them as very disrespectful people. So they can't speak up, and the civilians will not speak up against the Prophet because the Prophet demands respect. So they just stand there listening. And the Prophet recites the entire Surah Al-Najm. This is the 14th sajdah, or amongst the 14 sajdas of the Quran, this is one of them. It takes place in the end of the surah. That one of the ayahs, or when you recite, you have to perform sajdah. When the Prophet recited this surah and he finished, Ibn Abbas says that every single person that was present in that gathering, be it belief, that's why I mentioned earlier, that has an impact on believers and disbelievers. Be it a believer or a disbeliever, every single person fell into sajdah. Everyone. Believers and what? They couldn't control themselves. And it's like in sports, I mean, that's a bad example, but I got to use it. It's like in sports, when the opposite team, one of the players does something so astonishing and you stand up and start what? Clapping. You're like, oh, I'm sorry. Right? You start cheering for the player because what he did was so beautiful. You had no choice. You applaud the enemy because of what they did. Like, yo, that's talent. That's skill. So when these disbelievers heard the Quran being recited for the first time at one place, at one time, the impact of it was such that the believers fell into sajdah, but even the disbelievers couldn't control themselves because their minds and hearts were impacted by these verses, and they also fell into sajdah. Everyone at one time. And they got up, and now they had to give an excuse. It's like, again, like cheering for the wrong team. Like, well, I thought that was our guy. I thought he was on our team. I'm sorry, right? But he has a different color jersey. No, but I think, my eyes I was blurry. So what did these people say? Now, in this surah, there is a story called Gharaniq, and I'll talk about it when the ayah comes. But the story is in reference to shaitan, where the opinion is, or the claim is, that shaitan, while the Prophet was reciting the surah and he was receiving revelation, shaitan came and he also what do you do? Threw in some thoughts to the Prophet. And as the Prophet was reciting revelation, he also recited those verses. Na'udhu billahi min dhalik. Right? And when he recited those verses, where أَفْرَأَيْتُمُ اللَّاتَ وَالْعُزَّى وَمَنَاةَ الثَّالِثَ الْأُخْرَى, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is speaking about Lat, Uzza, and Manat, are the idols of Makkah. And then they claim that when the Prophet was reciting these verses, he also said that they are honorable and ask of them. Right? Which is obviously false, and I'll go into the details of the ayah and the story when it comes. So our understanding of it, and this is their main tafsirs, but what I really prefer, and this is what we should leave with, is when you mess up and everyone's watching, what do you got to do? You have to come up with a quick response. So the moment they got up, no, the reason why we did sajdah is because you praised our idols, not because of the surah. It was you praised our idols. That's why we did sajdah. What an absurd claim, right? But you got to justify it somehow, because why did everyone just do sajdah? So they came out with this claim, and hence Surah Al-Najm is a surah that even till today, disbeliever or believer, you recite it, your heart will be, and your mind both. That's why I started with that combination of what Imam Ghazali says. Your mind and your heart will be touched. Disbeliever or believer, every surah, but specifically in reference to this surah because it was the first surah recited in public gatherings with Muslims and non-Muslims. This is why one of the opinions of Imam Suyuti rahimahullah is, whenever you're in a public gathering with Muslims and non-Muslims, it's good to recite Surah Al-Najm, to ask you to recite, because of what it did to the disbelievers, right? Not in a demeaning way, or not in a way of creating conflict, but just because of the impact that it has on everyone. And that was what happened the first time it was revealed. So this is a Makki surah revealed in the 5th year of Hijrah or Nabuwah. Makki surahs have certain themes, and I won't say all of them because they're not relevant to us in this surah, but amongst them is the description or the speech of Akhirah. Amongst it is the discussion of the stories of the previous prophets, because there are stories in Madani surahs as well, but these are stories of the prophets themselves, not just their nations. And the third is the discussion of faith, because in Makkah, faith is being cultivated, and faith becomes cultivated through multiple ways. One of them is discussing how others cultivated it, like the nations before you. And secondly, to discuss what will happen to you if you don't bring it. Akhirah. So Allah speaks about these themes in Makki surahs, and Surah Najm is no different. It has 3 main themes. And all of that which we speak about will revolve around these 3 main themes. You guys ready for them? The first theme in this surah is the discussion of the final revelation. And this is what the first about 11 verses speak about. وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى. This entire passage speaks about the final revelation beginning. The second theme is about seeking salvation, is distinguishing truth versus falsehood, right? Revelation versus kahin, sorcery, magicians, or any other form of acquiring knowledge outside of that which is from our intellect and from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The third theme is the outcome, the final day, and it ends off with the discussion of the day of judgment. And what does the next surah begin with? The discussion of the day of judgment. What does the next surah begin with? Jannah and Jahannam. What does the next surah after that begin with? The continuation of the blessings of Jannah and Jahannam. It flows in perfect ordeal. Now, truth versus falsehood. The first one was the beginning of revelation, the final revelation. Then, almost the beginning of the end. The second was salvation. The third was the discussion of the outcome, the final day. So the last thing I will mention before I start reading the ayahs is we find some in many places in the Quran, Allah uses things like Najm, Tur, right? What are these? What are these things? Tangible, sensory objects, mahsusat, like you can touch them, you can feel them, you can see them. So what Tur, right? What Tini wa Zaytun, wa Najm, right? Wa Shamsi wal Qamar, wa Shamsi wa Duhaha, wal Qamari idha talaha. So the reason why this happens, Imam Razi rahimahullah says, is that the objective of sharing these mahsusat, that things that you can see, touch, and feel, the reason why Allah uses these is to explain to us that each of these things that you can sense and feel, the same way you believe in these things, what I'm about to tell you, you should also believe in. What's about to come to you, you should also believe in it the same way. Just like how you believe what Tur is a mountain and what Najm is a star, you must believe in the other aspects that you can't sense and feel if it's given to you in divine revelation. So that's the last aspect before beginning the surah. So as a recap, before I start the first 3 verses, my goal was to cover 3 verses today. Inshallah, I'll be able to do so. Recap. We started off with why revelation? Why revelation? Mind and heart, both. It doesn't teach you how to be a abid, it teaches you how to be a human. خَلَقَ الْإِنسَانِ نَا خَلَقَ الْإِيمَانِ. Right? Allah created human beings, and He gave human beings the guidance of the Quran to allow us to understand how to live as a human. The second discussion was the sequencing. And the first type of sequencing was of the Quran itself, the word Quran multiple times. The second form of sequencing was the what? The beginning of the surahs. You guys remember them? What was it? Tur, Najm, right? Mountain, star, moon, and then the entire sky, which contains all of it, the entirety of creation. The third sequence was how Surah Tur ends and how Surah Najm begins. Okay, let's move ahead. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins the beautiful surah by saying, وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى مَا ضَلَّ صَاحِبُكُمْ. Okay, it's good if I show the ayat, right? مَا ضَلَّ صَاحِبُكُمْ وَمَا غَوَى وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَى إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَى. So first I'll just read the translation. I swear by the star when it descends or as it descends. مَا ضَلَّ صَاحِبُكُمْ. Your companion, Muhammad sallallahu has not been misguided, neither has he erred, neither has he made a mistake. And he does not speak from his own inclination and own desires, hawa. Rather, in huwa illa wahyu yuha. Rather, it is revelation that he has been endowed with, revelation that he has been revealed. Now, let's unpack this. Allah begins with saying, وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى. I swear by the star as it descends. What is Najm? What is Allah referring to in saying Najm? He didn't say one nujum. Prior to this, he said what? One nujum. وَمِنَ اللَّيْلِ فَسَبِّحُ وَإِدْبَارًا nujum in the surah before. But over here, just one Najm. So Allah subhanahu is referring to a specific star. Which star is he referring to? The first opinion is that he's referring to a star, Thuraya, that was normally used by the sorcerers or fortune tellers to seek some form of information, right? It was a star that the Meccans and the Quraysh would find, and it was a cluster of 6 stars. It was a cluster of 6 stars, right? That the Quraysh would use as a form of guidance, as a form of, finding out secrets. So Allah is denying the claim that was made in the previous surah that you're saying that he is getting this information as a sorcerer? No. As a fortune teller? No, he's not. He's not a fortune teller. One Najm, right? This Najm that you're referring to, let me tell you about it. And Allah will continue that this is wahi. So the first opinion is that it's that specific star that the people of Makkah would use, the fortune tellers of Makkah would use to seek information. The second opinion is وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى. By the star as it falls, as it descends. It's referring to the shooting stars that we are told in hadith where it comes that these shooting stars are shayateen and the devils as they attempt to listen into the conversations that Allah is having with who? The angels. And as they aim or as they attempt to listen in, the angels throw a flame like a flamethrower at them. Right? شَوَاذٌ مِّن نَارٍ وَنُحَاسٌ فَلَا تَنْتَصِرَانِ. Allah, the angels throw a flame at them and this repels them. وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا Hawa. Even that claim or that idea of make a wish when you see a shooting star comes from there. That perhaps this star that is coming, it's coming with information that can benefit me. It's coming with something because it is where fortune tellers would get their information from. They would get it from these devils. This is why the Prophet, when he was asked about fortune tellers, he said, sometimes they're right, but most of the time they're what? They're wrong, because these devils, they end up getting what? Some information. Like when you listen to a conversation, you catch certain aspects and you catch certain things. So they would catch certain things and give that information to these people who had sold their souls to shayateen. So this one najm is being referred to. The first one was the Prophet does not gain his information by looking at stars and by calculating the movement of stars. Number two, meaning he doesn't get his information from simply looking at nature. Nature is a creation of Allah. Nature doesn't define the purpose of creation. Nature is a creation. The idea of identifying the beauty of nature and not identifying the beauty of the Creator is the biggest form of unintelligence, and it's absolutely absurd. What an audacious claim to identify the beauty of the sky, but not the person, not the deity who created the sky. How can one claim that? So the first is, nature is not what gives you your information. You don't sit in a cave and because of your reflection upon everything around you, you came out with information that nobody has heard. It's not just you sat in a corner of a room and you just looked up and you were stargazing and an epiphany came to you, and through that you were able to change the world around you. No change comes from that. Number two, you don't gain your information from how others do. These fortune tellers who take from shayateen as they're being flung across the skies when they're aiming to take information from the angels. Number two. Number three, وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى is referring to any star. Any star. That no star can give you information. إِذَا هَوَى. Hawa, we know. What does hawa mean for us? Like the most common word, like most common meaning of hawa is what? Hawa. Desire. But over here is coming to give you the meaning of what? What does it mean? You can't make this stuff up. If I could, I would be making a lot of money right now. I'm not. This is from Tafsir. And the beauty of these words. Hawa means desire. Hawa means inclination. وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى. Right? Star, when it comes down. This is why Razi rahimahullah says, the same way that a star is falling, hawa, Allah uses the word hawa for it, any person who, what? Falls for their desires has misguided themselves. Just like how a person, if they were to take from a star that is falling, hawa, what do we call it in English? We use the same verbiage. This person fell for his desires. He fell for his whims. He fell for his inclinations. Just like how you would identify a person to be incorrect if he just looks at a star and gives you information. وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى. Similarly, a person who just looks at their nafs and their desires and listens to it, this is also a form of falling. This is also a form of degrading yourself. Hawa. أَفْرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ hawa. Have you seen those people who have made their desires their God? Allah uses a similar concept. Just like how these people have used the stars as a frame of reference, you have used your thoughts and your desires as a frame of reference. Both are incorrect. Back in the days, the ideologies were to claim that these were idols because of stars, or this was a person that you could believe in because of a sorcerer or a fortune teller. You had these different forms of shirk. Now you have a different form of shirk. It doesn't come from a star. It comes from where? It's still hawa. It comes from your desires. Why does a person choose not to believe in certain things? Not because it doesn't make sense to their mind. It doesn't make sense to their heart. Hawa. The same way they used to use stars to create outcomes and conclusions, we use what? Our desires to create outcomes and conclusions. And we claim that there are solutions. Where did you get it from? I thought of it. When did thinking of something become a fact? It's hardly an opinion. It's hardly an opinion. Right? وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى. They're both hawa. They're both degraded. That's why hawa is seen to be something that is low. A person that lives as a slave to their desires, is living a low life. This is why Ibn Abbas used to say, Al-abdu thalathatun, that a slave is of three types. Slave is of three types. Number one, al-abd, a slave who is owned. Number two, al-abdu tama', a slave is a slave because of greed. So his greed controls them. His greed controls her, right? Or her greed controls her. I'll mess up these pronouns in these times. Very dangerous, right? That's what I'm referring to by these things, by the way. That this thought is enough for me to be convinced that I'm an opposite gender. This thought is also what? Hawa. It's just a desire. It's a thought. It's not real because you thought of it. Just like how the star can't tell you the truth, your desires cannot tell you the truth. إِن يَتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا الظَّنَّ وَإِنَّ الظَّنَّ لَا يُغْنِي مِنَ الْحَقِّ شَيْئًا. Allah says, your thoughts will never give you the outcome that is true. It will give you what you want to hear. It will give you what you want to and you wish to hear. So the third is al-abdu muttabi'u shahu, a slave shahun, a slave that is a slave to their desires. Why do we call a slave? Because they do what the master says without asking why, when, and how. Their job is to what? Just listen. Without the caveat is without caring about the outcome. Just do it. Right? Nike slogan. We're enslaved. Just do it. Right? So a slave is a slave with their desires because of the same reason. They do what their desire tells them to do without thinking about the outcome. Without thinking about the consequence. Just do it. وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى مَا ضَلَّ صَاحِبُكُمْ وَمَا غَوَى. That your companion, Allah refers to the Prophet as the companion of the Quraysh, because he's amongst you. We must be amongst the people to impact the people. مَا ضَلَّ صَاحِبُكُمْ. Your companion has not been misguided, neither has he erred. What is the difference between ضَلَّ and غَوَى? They both seem like they're very similar. Just 3 ayat. One more ayat and I'm done. ضَلَّ and غَوَى look similar, right? One says what? Straight, the other one says erred. So they pretty much mean almost the same thing, but they mean different things. ضَلَّ is the opposite of huda. ضَلَالَ. Imam Qutb rahimahullah shares this. ضَلَالَ is the opposite of hidayah. And ghawa is the opposite of rushd. Now let me explain. ضَلَالَ is having a destination, but what? But not getting there. Took the wrong turn. But you had the what? Destination. Because اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. Guidance, you had a destination, but you missed it. You took a wrong step. Ghawa is you not even having a destination of life. How many people are today? Where do you want to be? Where do you want to go? What's your akhirah looking? What's your goals? I don't really have one. That's ghawa. Not knowing where you want to be. Not knowing what your outcome is. Right? That's ghawa. The Prophet did not, like, it's not that dhalala happened, that he knew what he wanted to say, but he misspoke. Neither is it ghawa that he spoke without knowing what he wanted to say. Sometimes you can mess up, oh, I actually meant this. And sometimes you can say something that you didn't even know what you wanted to say. I don't know what I said. Right? Dhalla and ghawa. So Allah SWT is saying is, your companion has not he has not taken a pivot away from hidayah. Neither is he calling you to something that doesn't have a clear destination. مَا ضَلَّ صَاحِبُكُمْ وَمَا غَوَى. The second opinion is ضَلَّ is ضَلَالَةُ الْعَمَلِ, when a person messes up in his actions. And ghawa is when a person makes a mistake in their words. مَا ضَلَّ صَاحِبُكُمْ وَمَا غَوَى. Your companion has not made any move that is incorrect. Neither has he said anything which is wrong. He hasn't done either. So, when a person wants to claim that what you're saying is not true, they only have 2 ways to do it. Number 1, discredit the information. Number 2, discredit the what? The speaker. Both are options. So one is discredit the information. They can't do it anymore because Allah has already highlighted the Quran. This is why never in the Quran do you see the people ever saying the Quran is false. Because they can't. Even in today's time, the naysayers of Islam, they don't try to claim the Quran is not accurate. They attempt to take a jab at the Prophet ﷺ, right? At the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. So if you can't discredit the information, you discredit the the person who's relaying that information. So these people are discrediting the Prophet. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Yasin wal Quran al-Hakim innaka min mursalin. Surah Yasin. Over here it says, Ma dhalla sahibukum wa ma ghawa. Wa ma yantiqu anil hawa. He does not speak from anil hawa. Hawa now means what? Desires. That's how we translate it. That's how majority of the tafsirs translate it. That he does not speak from his whims and desires. It's not like he is thinking about something, he just what? The guys come around. This is the new thing. This is why deen never changes. Because once it came, it was set. Yes, the Prophet ﷺ, through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, could abrogate certain aspects of our sharia based upon the context and the need of its time. But when the Prophet ﷺ left this world, there was no revolution of deen like how it happened in Christianity and other religions, because he never spoke from himself. Right? It wasn't just because of what was, the idea of what is happening around us is so different, so we must think of a different way to respond. That's not true. Because وَمَا يَنْتِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ, our thoughts don't define how to respond. Sharia does. Yes, this much I can say, that the content of the box must be the same, but the packaging can change. Right? The appropriate packaging can be placed upon how we say, what we say, where we say it, with what tone we say it in. That we cannot be completely naive of the realities around us. So we package it better. We package it based upon the people that we're speaking to. But the content in the box cannot change. If the content has changed and the packaging is the same, it's wrong. Doesn't matter what the packaging looks like. A munafiq, the packaging is the same as a believer, but the content is of a hypocrite. You're wrong, right? Doesn't make a difference how you look and how you portray yourself. The content needs to remain the same. The content within our speech needs to remain the same. Our response needs to be the same. Our frame of reference needs to be the same. How we package it can change. Right? This is why the first person, and I spoke about this recently as well, the first person who was challenged with a new ideology in humanity was who? In humanity. First person who was challenged with a false ideology. Nuh alayhi salam. First prophet that was sent to a disbelieving nation. Shirk. The first time the shirk grew was in the nation of Nuh. Right? 950 years. First prophet. This is why in the Quran Allah always refers to the prophets Nabuwa with Nuh alayhi salam, because they both came to mushrik nations. Nonetheless, Nuh alayhi salam responds for 950 years. 950 years. Allah shares his response with us through that ideological warfare that was taking place in his time. 950 years, not once did he pivot away from his response. The response was always the same. أَنِ اعْبُدُ اللَّهِ أَنِ اعْبُدُ اللَّهِ أَنِ اعْبُدُ اللَّهَ وَاتَّقُوهُ وَأَطِيعُونَ. I worship Allah. Worship Allah. Refer back to Allah. Packaging can change. Ibrahim alayhi salam, again, ideological warfare. Idols came around. His response was the same as well. لا تعبد الشيطان. لا تعبد. Don't worship these things. وَاعْبُدُ اللَّهِ. Worship Allah. Similarly, we are not the first people who've had to deal with new ideologies. It's always been there. We have tried to respond in different ways and we have failed very apparently. The response must still be the same. أَنِ اعْبُدُ اللَّهِ. That we'll look back at what our Quran says and we'll respond to you from there. And if we don't know what the Quran says, we'll ask someone who does know. We can package it again. The content needs to be the same. مَا ضَلَّ صَاحِبُكُمْ مَا غَوَى وَمَا يَنْتِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَى. The second opinion that I wish to share, and I find this to be quite beautiful, is وَمَا يَنْتِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَى. He does not speak from hawa. What did hawa mean earlier? What did it mean earlier? وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى. From the falling star. وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى. I swear by the star as it falls, that your companion has not been misguided. And he has not spoken from the star. That star that you think he speaks from, let me clarify, he doesn't speak from that. Right? Eloquent speech is where you can take multiple meanings from the same speech that don't conflict, but they support one another. Eloquent speech is not speech where you can take multiple meanings that contradict. That is speech that lacks substance. Speech that you can take multiple meanings from, because we say it's deep, right? Not because it makes us feel good, but it gives us more meanings, right? Is that speech where you can take multiple meanings from that never conflict, but they supplement one another. This is what's happening over here. وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى, 3 meanings. None of them conflict. They all support. مَا ضَلَّ صَاحِبُكُمْ مَا غَوَى. ضَلَّ and غَوَى have 2 meanings. One was knowing where you're going, but you take the wrong turn. غَوَى, not knowing where you're going, which is even worse. Like before they would say, Akhirah will still make you to Jannah. The Jews and the Christians of that time. The mushriks would say, it's okay. نَحْنُ أَبْنَاءُ اللَّهِ, like the Jews. We love, Allah loves us. Then now we have a time where people say, there is no Akhirah. There is no destination. وَمَا غَوَى. The second is ضَلَّ, taking the wrong step physically. غَوَى, saying the wrong word from your mouth. They both support each other. They don't conflict with one another. وَمَا يَنْتِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَى. He doesn't speak from his desires. Neither does he speak from that star that I just swore by. He doesn't speak from either of these 2 things. Why did Allah not use takallama and use what? Nataqa. Because kalam is defined in any language. Kalam is defined as speech that can be understood. That can be understood. But nutq is defined as any utterance. Any utterance. Even when a child speaks, we say he what? He spoke, but do you understand it? No. That's nutq though. That's not kalam. Kalam is something where you can take meaning from. Nutq is something that you hear, you know he's trying to say something, but you can't what? Understand it. وَمَا يَنْتِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَى. Forget giving you detailed information. He doesn't even utter a word from his desires. He doesn't even claim any form of utterance that is from these stars. Like, forget giving you a conclusion. He doesn't even give you an intro from these stars. In other words, we don't need to supplement what the Quran says from anywhere else. If it's there, where like science is there to supplement the Quran, great. That's awesome. But we don't need it. Imam Nawawi rahimahullah would say, Al-Iman imanun bila ilmin. That Iman is Iman without any proof. We don't need any other proof. All we need is the Quran. That's all a person needs, because it has everything. He doesn't forget a conclusion. No utterance comes from his desires, and no utterance comes from that star that you were referring to. This proves to us that everything the Prophet said is also part of Sharia. People of the past, there were certain firqas that would say Quran is Quran. And today there's people like that as well. I say Quran is Quran. That's all we need. All we need is Quran. No. وَمَا يَنْتِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ. Quran is the ultimate form of guidance, but the manifestation in the most complete manner is the seerah and the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. We cannot understand what Quran is telling us, not that it needs seerah, but seerah gives us a relatable manifestation of it. It allows us to understand what it means. I'll give you an example. Allah says, speak softly. How do we understand how to speak soft? How did the Prophet speak? The Quran says, be good to your neighbors. How do we understand how to be good to our neighbor? How was the Prophet with his neighbor? The Quran says, be good to your spouse. How do we understand that? How was the Prophet with his spouse? Without the seerah, we can't understand what? Quran. And I'll end with this. The people that claim that hadith and sunnah is inferior and is not needed, when you give them these examples, they say, no, those are character things. We understand that. But we're speaking about what? Aspects of worship. If character concepts can be concluded and built up from seerah, how can you differentiate and say that aspects of worship cannot be built up from the sunnah and the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ? وَمَا يَنْتِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ. Everything the Prophet uttered came from where? إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ. It was revelation that he was given as revelation, and the definition of revelation is you could not get it from anywhere else. Where could you get it from? A star. Well, it's not from a star. Where could you get it from? Your desires. It's not from your desires. Where could you get it from? Shayateen. It's not from shayateen. And Allah responds to the claims that were made in Surah Tur in these 4 verses. These 4 verses are a response to the verses in Surah Tur where they're saying that this Quran came from these different places. And Allah denies that in these verses. And then He speaks about the ultimate prize of revelation, which was Mi'raj. Allah give us ability to enjoy these verses, to learn from them, and inshallah to implement them in our life. Inshallah, we'll see you all next week.